On the morning of June 19, 1944, the waters of the Philippine Sea were the stage for one of the largest naval engagements in human history. To the American pilots in the air, it would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a day of overwhelming aerial dominance. But several hundred feet below the rolling blue swells, the war was silent, claustrophobic, and governed by an entirely different set of rules. For the crew of the USS Albacore, a Gato-class submarine designated SS-218, that morning began like so many others, a tedious cycle of scanning the horizon through a periscope and monitoring the rhythmic sonar pings that defined their reality. Everything changed at 07:33. Commander James W. Blanchard, peering through the lens of the periscope, spotted a sight that would make any submariner's heart race. Rising over the horizon were the massive masts of a Japanese carrier task force. But this wasn't just any carrier, it was the Taiho, the brand-new 30,000-ton flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy. She was the Great Phoenix, a ship designed to be virtually unsinkable, featuring an armored flight deck and the most advanced damage control systems Japan had to offer. She was on her maiden combat voyage, leading the charge to stop the American advance toward the Philippines. Blanchard didn't hesitate. Despite the presence of a heavy destroyer screen, he maneuvered the Albacore into a precarious firing position. The tension inside the steel hull of the submarine was thick enough to touch. Every man knew that a single mistake, a mechanical failure, or a lucky Japanese depth charge could end their lives in an instant. At 08:09, Albacore loosed a spread of 6 torpedoes. One of them found its mark, striking the Taiho on her starboard side. In the immediate aftermath, it didn't look like a killing blow. The Taiho stayed level, her engines kept turning, and she continued to launch aircraft. But the torpedo had done something far more insidious than simply punching a hole in the hull. It had ruptured the ship's aviation fuel lines. As the carrier continued to steam forward, volatile fumes began to leak throughout the vessel, turning the unsinkable flagship into a giant, floating pressure cooker. Hours later, a massive internal explosion ripped the Taiho apart, sending her to the bottom along with over 1,600 of her crew. The sinking of the Taiho was more than just a tactical victory. It was a psychological gut punch to the Japanese high command. A single American submarine had effectively decapitated the Japanese carrier fleet at the very moment they needed it most. This single event defined the USS Albacore's legacy, but it was only one chapter in a career that saw her become one of the most successful and feared hunters in the Pacific. The Albacore belonged to the Gato class, a breed of long-range fleet boats designed specifically to bridge the vast distances of the Pacific. These submarines were the tip of the spear in a silent, unrestricted war against Japanese shipping. Before the Taiho, Albacore had already earned a reputation as a relentless predator. But it was the Philippine Sea that etched her name into the history books forever. In a conflict where battleships and carriers usually stole the headlines, the Albacore proved that a relatively small crew, operating out of a cramped steel tube, could change the course of an entire campaign with a single, well-placed shot. To understand why a ship like the USS Albacore was built, we have to look at the sheer desperation of the United States Navy in the weeks following the attack on Pearl Harbor. With much of the Pacific battleship fleet sitting on the bottom of a Hawaiian harbor, the American military was forced into a defensive crouch. The Japanese Empire was expanding at a terrifying rate, seizing islands and resources across a vast expanse of ocean. In those early dark months of 1942, the United States had very few ways to actually strike back. The carrier fleet was small and stretched thin. But there was one branch of the Navy that was ready to take the fight directly to the enemy's doorstep. the silent service. The Albacore was a member of the Gato class, a lineage of submarines that would eventually become the backbone of the American undersea effort. Before the war, naval theorists hadn't quite decided what a submarine's primary job should be. Many believed they should serve as scouts for the main battle fleet, hovering on the fringes of massive battleship engagements. But as the reality of the Pacific War set in, that mission changed. The Pacific was simply too big, and the Japanese supply lines were too vital. The Navy needed fleet boats, submarines with the range, speed, and endurance to operate independently for months at a time, thousands of miles from the nearest friendly base. When the Albacore was laid down at the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, she was designed with this long-haul philosophy in mind. Measuring over 301 feet long, she was a massive leap forward compared to the cramped, temperamental S-boats of the previous decade. The Gato class featured a strengthened hull that allowed for deeper diving depths to escape Japanese escorts, and perhaps most importantly, they were among the first submarines to feature air conditioning. While that might sound like a luxury, it was a technical necessity. In the sweltering, humid heat of the South Pacific, moisture from the crew's breath and the tropical air would frequently short out the submarine's complex electrical systems. Keeping the air dry meant keeping the boat functional. The Albacore was commissioned in June 1942, entering the war at a pivotal moment. The American strategy had shifted to unrestricted submarine warfare. The goal was no longer just to sink enemy warships. It was to dismantle the Japanese economy by sinking every merchant ship, oil tanker, and troop transport that dared to leave port. The Albacore was built to be a predator of the high seas, capable of surface speeds of 21 knots, which allowed her to chase down convoys, and a submerged endurance that could keep her hidden through hours of relentless depth charging. However, the crew of the Albacore didn't just inherit a state-of-the-art machine, they inherited a massive responsibility. In 1942, the American submarine force was plagued by a scandalous secret. Their primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, was deeply flawed. They ran too deep, their magnetic exploders didn't work, and even when they hit a target directly, the firing pins often failed to trigger. This meant the Albacore and her sister ships had to be better, stealthier, and more patient than their enemies. They had to overcome their own equipment failures while operating in waters where the Japanese held total air and sea superiority. The Albacore wasn't just going into the Pacific to fight. She was going there to prove that the American submarine doctrine could actually work. A submarine is only as dangerous as the men who walk its deck plates. While the Gato class was a marvel of engineering, the USS Albacore was defined by a specific culture of aggression and technical proficiency that started from the top down. Life aboard the SS-218 was a strange, rhythmic existence. For weeks at a time, the crew of roughly 80 men lived in a world of artificial light and recycled air. They shared hot bunks, where one man crawled into a mattress still warm from the man who had just finished his shift. The air was a permanent cocktail of diesel fumes, hydraulic fluid, and unwashed bodies. A smell that would seep into their skin and hair so deeply it would take weeks of shore leave to wash away. The man who first forged the Albacore into a weapon was Lieutenant Commander Richard C. Lake. Taking the boat on its first 3 patrols, Lake established the Albacore as a hunter that didn't just wait for targets, it chased them. In December 1942, off the coast of New Guinea, Lake proved the boat's mettle. He intercepted a Japanese task force and, in a display of incredible nerves, sank the light cruiser Tenryu. It was a major victory for a brand-new boat, marking only the second time an American submarine had sunk a Japanese cruiser in the war. This success earned the crew a presidential unit citation, a rare honor that signaled to the rest of the fleet that the Albacore was a lucky boat, though any submariner would tell you that luck was usually just another word for discipline. But the experience of the crew wasn't just defined by the moments of the kill, it was defined by the hours of being the prey. When the Albacore attacked, the Japanese response was almost always a rain of depth charges. For the men in the engine room or the torpedo tubes, this was the most grueling part of the war. They had to stand in absolute silence, sweating in the stifling heat, listening to the click of the Japanese depth charge detonators, followed by a bone-shaking explosion that felt like a giant sledgehammer hitting the hull. They watched the light bulbs flicker and pop, and listened for the terrifying sound of a spray of water that would signal a hull breach. Through these trials, the crew developed an unspoken language. A glance or a nod was often enough to communicate during an attack when every decibel of sound mattered. By the time James W. Blanchard took command in 1944, the Albacore was a seasoned veteran vessel. Blanchard inherited a crew that moved with a practiced, lethal efficiency. He was a commander who trusted his men and his machine, a quality that allowed him to remain remarkably calm during the approach on the Taiho. Under his leadership, the boat's operational tempo reached its peak. They weren't just sinking ships, they were gathering intelligence, rescuing downed American aviators, and mapping minefields. The story of the Albacore's crew is one of extreme transitions, from the absolute boredom of a long transit to the heart-pounding terror of a night surface attack. They operated in the silent service, a branch that suffered the highest casualty rate of any part of the U.S. military. Yet, the men of the Albacore carried a quiet pride. They knew that while the battleships fought for the headlines, they were the ones slowly and methodically strangling the enemy's lifeline. By mid-1944, the Albacore had become a symbol of everything a fleet boat should be, a relentless, invisible, and devastatingly effective instrument of naval power. By the autumn of 1944, the USS Albacore was no longer the underdog of the Pacific. She was a seasoned veteran with a reputation that commanded respect throughout the submarine force. The war had shifted dramatically. The Japanese merchant marine was in tatters, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was reeling from the loss of its carrier air power. Yet, as the American net tightened around the Japanese home islands, the missions became arguably more dangerous. The shallow, cold waters closer to Japan were heavily mined and constantly patrolled by desperate anti-submarine forces. This was the environment into which the Albacore sailed for her 11th and final combat patrol. On October 24, 1944, the Albacore slipped out of Pearl Harbor under the command of Lieutenant Commander Hugh R. Rimmer. Her destination was the northeast coast of Honshu and the southern reaches of Hokkaido, the very doorstep of the Japanese Empire. The mission was part of a coordinated effort to sever the last remaining supply lines between the Japanese mainland and their northern territories. For the crew, there was a sense of grim professionalism. They were operating in a target-rich environment, but it was also a place where the margin for error was non-existent. The climax of this final mission didn't come in the form of a dramatic surface battle or a long-distance torpedo shot against a carrier. Instead, it was defined by the invisible, silent hazard that every submariner feared more than depth charges: the naval mine. On the morning of November 7, 1944, the Albacore was patrolling submerged near the dangerous waters of the Tsugaru Strait. This narrow body of water, separating the islands of Honshu and Hokkaido, was a vital maritime artery. But it was also a graveyard of hidden explosives. According to Japanese records recovered after the war, a patrol boat in the area witnessed a sudden, massive underwater explosion. The blast was so powerful that it sent a column of water and debris nearly 100 feet into the air. Among the items that bobbed to the surface were bits of cork, heavy oil, and provisions, the unmistakable calling cards of a destroyed submarine. The Japanese boat immediately moved to the site and dropped depth charges, but there was no response. The Albacore had struck a mine in a field that had been recently reinforced. There were no survivors and no final radio transmission. For weeks, the Navy Department waited for a signal that never came. The Albacore was eventually reported overdue and presumed lost, a clinical phrase that masked the tragedy of 85 men disappearing in an instant. The loss was a staggering blow to the American submarine community. They hadn't just lost a ship, they had lost one of their most successful aces. At the time of her sinking, the Albacore was credited with sinking over 10 ships, including the Taiho, making her one of the most productive boats of the entire conflict. This final mission serves as a stark reminder of the reality of the silent service. Even for a boat as lucky and well-handled as the Albacore, the ocean remained a neutral, unforgiving environment. Her end was not the result of a tactical blunder or a failure of courage, but the simple, brutal math of operating in a combat zone where the enemy's defenses were at their most concentrated. The Albacore went down fighting in the Empire's backyard, a predator to the very end, leaving behind a legacy of service that few other vessels could ever hope to match. For nearly 80 years, the final resting place of the USS Albacore remained one of the Great Pacific's many unsolved mysteries. She was a ghost of the deep, a legendary hunter that had simply vanished while on the hunt. To the families of the 85 men lost on that November morning in 1944, there was only the cold administrative finality of a missing in action report. But the Albacore was too significant a ship to be forgotten by history. Her story didn't end with the explosion off the coast of Hokkaido. Instead, it grew into a legacy of tactical brilliance and, eventually, a modern-day scientific quest for closure. The historical impact of the Albacore is best measured by the sheer scale of the damage she inflicted. By the end of the war, the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee officially credited her with sinking 10 Japanese vessels, totaling over 74,000 tons. While other submarines may have sunk more individual ships, few could match the strategic weight of the Albacore's kills. By removing the Taiho from the board, she didn't just sink a carrier. She shattered the Japanese Navy's last best hope of turning the tide in the Pacific. She proved that the American fleet boat was not just a commerce raider, but a true capital ship killer, capable of altering the trajectory of major naval campaigns. The mystery of her disappearance was finally solved in the early 2020s. Using historical Japanese records as a map, a team led by Dr. Tamaki Ura of the University of Tokyo utilized advanced remotely operated vehicles to scan the seabed off the coast of Hokkaido. In early 2023, the U.S. Navy's Naval History and Heritage Command officially confirmed their findings. There, in the dark, cold currents of the Tsugaru Strait, lay the unmistakable remains of the SS-218. The wreck was found upright, partially buried in the sand at a depth of nearly 800 feet. Despite the damage from the mine, key features like the periscope shears and the 20mm gun mount were still recognizable. For the first time in 8 decades, the Albacore was no longer lost. She was found. Today, the wreck site is treated as a hallowed war grave, a silent monument to the men who served within her steel ribs. The discovery provided a profound sense of peace to the descendants of the crew, turning a tragic disappearance into a documented piece of history. But the Albacore's legacy also lives on in the evolution of naval architecture. The lessons learned from her patrols and the performance of the Gato class influenced submarine design for decades, leading eventually to the teardrop-shaped hulls of the nuclear age, a design evolution that, fittingly, began with an experimental submarine also named the Albacore. As we look back at the Second World War, the USS Albacore stands as a testament to the silent service. She was a vessel defined by extreme discipline, technical precision, and a quiet, lethal courage. Her story reminds us that history is often made in the shadows, far beneath the waves, by men who knew that their greatest victories might never be witnessed by the world above. The Albacore began her journey as a tool of a desperate navy, became a legend of the Pacific, and today she rests as a permanent sentinel on the seafloor, a reminder of the high cost of victory and the enduring spirit of those who sail into the deep.